All right, so ethics. Okay, so this one is really much more sort of high level, I guess, than procurement, which is really very practical. So, what are ethics? Ethics are important to our profession, but they're also important to everyday life. So ethics are the code that guides our life, that guide how we treat each other, that really set the boundaries as to how we deal with each other. I suppose you could say, which is what separates us from the animals, if you like to put it crudely. It outlines the rules of engagement between people that stops us from essentially from killing each other. Ethics are nowadays dealt with on a very rational and abstract level, but they developed from philosophical and religious codes. So they were very much linked to certain belief systems in the past, and you could argue that they are still linked to certain belief systems, just different ones nowadays. One thing that we can say is that ethics and integrity go hand in hand. So the two terms go hand in hand. um, and Yes, so what are ethics? Ethics include considerations such as ethical behavior, equal of opportunity, social justice, obligations to the public and those we deal with, and aspirations to excellence or a strong desire to make our world better through what we do. Okay, so in terms of the profession, a lot of our codes, as you'll see, do refer specifically to those things, those 5 points over there. Really, what it is, I guess, is that it provides protection for those who are unable to protect themselves. It sets out how we relate to each other, how we relate to people we know, as well as to people that we don't know. Um, and uh, and it comes into everything that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Ethics includes the something as simple as paying people on time as agreed to for work that they've done for us. Ethics means that we don't litter and we dispose of our rubbish properly, and so on and so forth. Ethics basically means that we don't rip people off. In the big picture, these are called social ethics. Now, social ethics also look at other types of other look ethics. Also, social ethics also come into many of the issues that we deal with as architects. So really, it comes down in many ways to how to improve the world that we live in. I think what's interesting about this is that ethics are very much based on context. So and it really does depend on who you talk to in that case and the context from which they come with. In the uh, in the late 80s and early 1990s, there was a lot of institutional development in Australia, and a lot of architects were getting a lot of work designing things like community centres, nursing homes, police stations, prisons, those kinds of institutional buildings. And there was really a very large movement as to how to redefine the architecture of these sorts of institutions. They were all seen as being similar in terms of being an institution. Hospitals were other ones, other typologies as well. And this was very much this kind of change of definition of the architecture of those institutions was seen as something very much that was going to make society better and make the institution itself better. And so this meant that a lot of architecture students were dealing with the same issues, right? Because you've got your studio leaders who were bringing projects from their offices into the design studio. So students were also engaging in these sorts of issues. Now, when I was doing my master's, I had an interesting encounter. Not an interesting encounter. It wasn't even an encounter. Interesting conversation with one of my classmates who had come from South Africa. So, she was new, and we were talking about what we did and what we were interested in. And she said to me, "God, I couldn't imagine being involved in something as bad as designing a police station. I think we should all run as far away from them as we can." And I had no idea what was going on. I really was quite mystified as to why it is. But once she explained to me that the situation in apartheid South Africa, so this was the South Africa where there was this serious racial division and imbalance before Nelson Mandela managed to managed to be part of the undoing of all of that. Many architects there refused to design or be involved in state institutions because they were seen as institutions of controlled repressions, and police stations and prisons were very much part of that system. Part of that system that were controlling and repressing people, and basically anti-democratic and quite fascist in the way that they ran. Okay, so that's easy to understand. You've got a totalitarian racial minority government in South Africa, and it's not a stretch to see how different that is to the Australian government of the time. And also this kind of attitude goes on. Things have changed in South Africa, and it's like one could argue that there's much more hope now because of the way that things can be run rather than how they are run. But interesting thing I found recently online was a movement by architects in the US, led by this guy Rafael Sperry from San Francisco. So his thing basically is that he is concerned with the disproportionate representation of certain groups in the US prison systems. So there's too many black people and there's too many Hispanic people in prison. And they're usually poor people, uneducated because they're poor, and they're just generally underprivileged. So his thing is that rather than being a civic institution, which is how we might have considered it here, is actually a form of repression. And what he thinks is actually an ethical question, whether architects should be involved in projects like this. So his movement is that the Institute of Architects, the American Institute of Architects, also the AIA, should take a stance to prohibit its members from designing prisons in the US. Because the AIA has a very strong ethical code, right? Or so he thought they would. But the AIA said that it doesn't regulate building types, and the idea of trying to regulate such types, if it became a rule, would be hard to enforce. So where he goes from here is basically that he misunderstood that the AIA, the ethics of the AIA might actually extend to these kinds of bigger picture type situations. But I suppose the questions for us might be, as a practicing architect, would you design an offshore processing center at Manus Island or in Nauru? On the same note, how about designing abortion facilities in hospitals and clinics, or designing nuclear power stations? What are the ethical boundaries for architects, and do we need to take a stand? So let's just keep that in mind let's just keep that in mind, because I think it does. We need to look at these kinds of big picture questions, of these big questions, in relation to how professional ethics is codified. The architectural ethics are codified. So there are three levels of codes for architectural ethics. They are the Code of Conduct of the Architects Accreditation Council of Australia, the individual state and territory architects boards codes of conduct, and not all of them have these codes of conduct, so they have to go back to legal principle or to the Architects Act. Yeah, and I think the ACT. The ACT Architects Act doesn't include a code of conduct from memory, but these are things that are uneven. Yeah, not all states and territories have codes of conduct. And then the third one is the Australian Institute of Architects Code of Professional Conduct. So what we'll do is we'll go through the three of them, and then think about what it actually means. I suppose what we need to think about is enforcement. What does it mean to actually fall foul of these institutions in terms of the practice of architecture? So if we look at the AACA's Code of Conduct, and I've loaded this up onto this week's Moodle, and I've also loaded the two little articles that describe Sperry's position for your interest. But I've also loaded up a few other things on there which we'll come to. So really, the main thing that we're looking at in the AACA's Code of Conduct is the professional standards, part 3 of the Code of Conduct. So they have 7 professional standards. The first being the obligation to serve the public interest, the second being responsibility to contribute to the quality and sustainability of the natural and built environment and health and safety of the general public, so public interest type codes. Endeavor to engender respect in the profession, to apply reasonable care and competence to improve technical knowledge and skills, not to discriminate on the basis of race, religion, gender, ethnic ancestry, age, or sex, communicate with the public in a professional, responsible manner, and to maintain standards of integrity in architectural practice. So if we look at those things one by one, number 2, responsibility to contribute to the quality and sustainability of the natural environment. Does that mean that we will be knocking back commissions to design nuclear power plants, or nuclear waste disposal plants? Endeavor to engender respect in the profession. Does this mean that we will end up with architectural education also going that way, which means that there'll be much less yelling and screaming by certain people, myself included, much less yelling and screaming of teachers at or / with students, apply reasonable care and competence to improve technical knowledge and skills. Does this mean that we will then be concerned about the environment when we're specifying marble that has huge carbon miles that comes from countries with inequitable labor practices such as China and Iran? So these kinds of things are great things to put forth, and they do affect the everyday way that we run our practices. Must not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, gender, ethnic ancestry, age, or sex. So you can just see what your sort of old-fashioned blokey architectural employer will say to a middle-aged recent graduate of a Masters of Architecture who also happens to be African and speaks with different kind of accents. It may how can we tell whether they're going to be treated ethically or responsibly and according to the code of conduct? Is it too easy to hide behind certain things to be able to say that one is that to come up with a different to come up with an excuse as to why one is not hiring them on that basis, when why one is not hiring them on that basis is because of that basis. Complicated stuff. Anyway, all things to think about. Now, moving right along, in part B of the Code of Conduct, it has more detailed things about the specific clauses of Part A. And please go and have a look at the Code of Conduct yourselves. And it's not very long, and it is something that will form part of the exam. It's got points 4 to 10, which you can see up there, which is point 4 is actually about integrity, reasonable care, following the normal standards of architectural practice, laws, codes, and so on and so forth. So what this means is that to be able to practice ethically, architects need to know about all of these things, or need to know how to find out about them in order to conduct themselves properly according to the code. Really, a lot of these things are about avoiding conflicts of interest and also informing clients of any possible conflict. It's about promptness in service provision, something that, of course, we all learn about in architecture school. Impartiality with building contracts, knowing when to withdraw from services due to contrary activities and breaches, and about truth in statements based on knowledge. You're sure to make money from hiring me as an architect. But it's also about recording and looking after documents and other proper procedures around checking and so on and so forth. So this code actually comes right into the heart of the proper practice and the good practice of architecture. And it's also about working within one's knowledge limits. I'm sure I can design as good a hospital as Cox. Just employ me and everyone will be happy. Now, client relationships. Really, what they're talking about there is truthfulness, realistic expectations, fair comparisons of competitors, proper engagement procedures through agreements, acquisition, maintenance of appropriate knowledge for the project. And so on and so on and so on. So really, the way this thing is set up is really to say that all the things that to act ethically as an architect, we have to do all the things that we are supposed to do in a certain way. So really, at the end of the day, what we are doing is trying to maintain an objective decision-making process and trying to avoid any situation where we enter into inappropriate relationships which could cloud those decision-making processes. So I'm going to ask you to think about examples of inappropriate relationships and also why they are inappropriate, and then we'll talk about it after the lecture in the tutorial. Okay, and also feel free to relate them back to individuals and architects that we hold in high esteem in terms of architectural design, architectural history, and what have you. Of course, because the code is concerned for our main relationships, it is very concerned with client relationships and very specific with client relationships, and which are generally recorded in client and architect agreements. But if we go to 5.2 in the code, um, uh, they basically lay out very specifically what agreements are to contain. So basically, what are the specific requirements as to the services to be provided to the client? What is the scope and nature of the work, the cost and service, the method of reporting, that the architect is to be registered, um, how we are going to get client authorization to proceed with services, to amend services, and to apply pre-existing agreements, how we're going to resolve disputes, and then how we are going to agree to terminate services by either party. There's also arrangements as to how the services will be withdrawn rather due to it being contrary to public interest, a breach of law, and so on and so forth. And then also contact arrangements. I mean, this is like we've got in the ethical code of conduct, is telling us that clients shouldn't be calling us, or we shouldn't be calling clients after a certain time. It comes down to something as basic as that. Um, the next three parts of the code of conduct, parts 6 through 8, really make insurance as an ethical thing. So it's unethical not to have professional indemnity insurance. So although it is part of law, it is also unethical. So it's a kind of double banger. We're being controlled by law and also by the code of conduct. To keep one's knowledge of practice and project up through continuing professional development systems, that's ethics now too. And then dispute resolution, we've talked about it in the previous slide, but it's really about how one can avoid disputes, and then if things go too far, to have a plan B as to figure out who is going to be able to deal with to resolve the disputes in the best way for both parties that are in dispute, the architect and the client. Now, communicating with the public is also an ethical thing. So it means that we can't go and big note ourselves to say that we can do things that we can't do. So we need to accurately represent our qualifications, experience, and authorship. Maybe I should have given this lecture to you before you did your business plan. But I think by and large, most of you are not making claims beyond what you can do. Architects need to be clearly identified. Our registration numbers need to be clear. We need to give the correct and accurate attribution of who was involved when we put in for awards applications. And we need to disclose that if we're involved in any fee for service or fee for product or product placement in terms of projects that we are working on to resolve perceived conflicts of interest. Perceived, not even actual conflicts of interest. And then, of course, state conflicts of interest, clear of bias, and benefits fair and undisclosed. So it's not saying that you can't make money from things, but that needs to be made clear to your clients, and to give them the choice of whether they actually want to be involved in this or not. Because, of course, there may well be positives for both them and for you, or you may actually even choose to pass on that advantage to your clients. So for me, I always pass on, I always charge my clients for the time that it takes me to go into a supplier's to choose fittings and fixtures for my clients, and they generally give me trade price, and I generally pass on that trade price directly onto my clients, so that they can't come back at me and accuse me of taking advantage of them. And then, interestingly, it's not only about architects and clients, but it's also about how architects deal with each other and deal with the profession. So it promotes high standards of integrity, honesty, and fairness in dealing with other architects. And really, this is to demonstrate actions that sustain confidence in the public of the profession, to promote the advancement of architecture and the standards of architectural proficiency, to attribute the moral rights of other architects, to have due regard to the codes of conduct, and in terms of dealing with works for which they are original architects, to inform original architects of assumption of responsibility, and to inform them of the new that you are actually involved in a project in view of the nature of the original agreements and scope. And this is really talking about making sure that you're not putting yourself in a position which is going to get you into trouble because the original arrangement has not yet been resolved. So, what happens when something goes wrong? Who does one complain to when one has been the victim of unethical behavior by an architect? Or what happens when an architect has a complaint lodged against them? What are the penalties? Now, we've been looking at the AACA Code of Ethics. So, do we complain to the AACA? No, we don't, because the AACA are an NGO which represents the various state and territory architects boards. So really, it's the architects boards that is our mode of complaint, or the public's avenue of complaint. So the AACA puts out this code as a fallback in case a state and territory architects board does not actually have a specific code of conduct. But some of them do, and these codes and regulations of the architects boards are obviously going to be along the same lines as the AACA, because they are in concert with each other, right? And it is, but of course, the enforcement of the codes is really by the state and territory architects boards. So, if we take an example of what they do, what I've got here is a few things, a few reports a few lists of disciplinary actions against architects by the New South Wales Architects Registration Board. This is back in 2014. So I don't know whether you can see it there, but really what we've got there, which I've highlighted in yellow, the first one is a lack of judgment regarding electronic signatures. So essentially, an architect has given his electronic or her electronic signature, his electronic signature to a client or a third party in order to make applications on their behalf. So the architect is not being responsible by letting other people put in applications under his name and his signature. The next one there, Michael Blakely, that's really that they breached the Architect Act by providing architectural services while not on the register of architects. So in other words, architectural services have to be provided by an architect. If you're not on the register, then you can't call yourself an architect. And on the same note, not providing professional indemnity insurance while also not being registered as an architect. And these are all publicly available documents. So there's very much a kind of name and shame thing happening over here. Further along the same list, we've got the penalties. So essentially, the New South Wales Registration Board at that time had a point system. So you can see over here that what they need to do is they need to pay 4 penalty points for each of the 9 offences. So there's 36 penalty points in total, and then they're going to stay 18 penalty points, right? So So really, if we look at 36 um, 36 penalty points minus the 18 penalty points that they don't have to pay for, at 110 dollars per penalty point, then that's what's that 1880, was it 1800 and something dollars that he had to pay. So the penalties are really for high flyers a good night out, if that. Okay, so the penalties, are the penalties ethical, or what is the aim of these things? They're quite common. Most of them are actually about not maintaining registration or not maintaining indemnity insurance. This one on the top here is really about the architect not having a client architect agreement in place before he started working, which of course is not an ethical thing, because then the client doesn't know what they're getting. The next one down is actually about um, uh, not paying any attention to the client's budget. So if we think back to what Greg Breckenridge was talking about in McKenzie v. Miller, really was that the architect was preparing designs without actually caring about what the client thought about how much money they wanted to spend. So in this case, not only is it unethical, it's also illegal. Okay, so the two often go together, but being unethical covers a much broader spread than just about matters of legality. Okay, now moving right along. Here we've got from the April 2016 Register of Disciplinary Actions of the New South Wales Architects Registration Board. We've really got something about. We've got the architect being found guilty of unsatisfactory professional conduct because they failed to act with integrity or fairness. The architect failed to provide information that was truthful, accurate, unambiguous, and relevant to the client's interests. The client sought to receive payments and other inducements while deliberately concealing this fact from the client. So, in other words, the architect might have gone to a supplier, and the supplier said, if you can convince the architect, the client to use this particular sort of stone, we'll give you 10% of the price of the stone. And the clients found out about this, and the architects, without the architect actually telling them, and gone to town with it, essentially. The next one is actually going back to the idea of continuous professional development. So it's not only enough to be registered as an architect. You've got to continuously update your knowledge and your skills through continuous professional development. It's unethical not to do so. From the April 2016 register, really to take client's money but not provide the services according to the client architect agreement. Okay, so now we move on to the third one, which is really the AIA's Code of Professional Conduct. Now, all these things are very similar in their nature, so it is very, very much the same as the AACA one, but you can see some different words here. So social justice is something that the AIA is concerned with, but the AACA is not. However, the values and expectations of the AACA code and the AIA code do match up closely. So what I want you guys to do really is to go through the code of conduct, especially the four principles and the standards within those principles, because they are the things that will be examined on. So if we look at these four principles, This is how it will look like in there. So you can see principle one, obligations to the public, and then under that there are 5 standards. What's interesting here is it talks about conserving natural and cultural heritage, not to be deceptive or misleading, to abide the law, abide the rules, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very clear as to what one needs to do to be an ethical architect under these codes, under the AACA code and the AIA code. I suppose what we need to think about here is what is there anything that we do or that we've seen that actually contravenes these things? So principle one, obligations to the public. Principle two, obligations to the clients. I'll leave you to read that and to go through that, read and understand that. But it's really about working with skill and diligence, working with undue delay, communications, keeping the client informed, accepting responsibility, not to be corrupt, maintain confidentiality, and so on and so forth. Stuff that we've heard before in the ACA one. Principle 3 we see down here is the obligations to the profession, honesty, fairness, not to associate with unsuitable persons. What is an unsuitable person? Not to bring the profession into disrepute. So, and then the final principle is the obligations to colleagues. So the profession is really the big picture thing. The colleagues are other architects here. Inside and outside any particular office. So it's not only the people that you work with, but also other architects who are in the same place, or other architectural business who are in the same place. So what's interesting here is that really the circumstances under which an architect can take over another architect's commission. Okay, so according to the AIA Code of Conduct, it's much more specific than the AACA conduct. But what the AIA's code requires is that the client informs the old architect that the project is being taken over by a new architect. Seems very simple, but what then happens is that the old architect knows that who the new architect is, and if they have a problem with the client, they can then bring it up with the new architect, and the new architect then is bound to make sure that everything is resolved before they take it on. Okay, so if your client says, "Screw you, I'm not paying you, I'm going to get another architect to finish the works," the other architect then has to ask the client to inform the first architect that they are taking over. And it's really a way of having the first architect to have some measure of recourse from the client from the second architect. I mean, what's interesting about this is that the AIA is an NGO, but it has no legislative power. The AACA is also an NGO, but it gets its power through the State and Territory Architects Board. So really what happens is that if one contravenes the code badly, the AIA code badly, one's AIA membership can be stripped. Does this affect one's architectural registration, the thing that requires one requires to practice and call oneself an architect? No. Okay, so this is an interesting thing. That interesting situation. Now a lot of I've loaded this on the Moodle, on the Canvas module, but it can also be found on the Acumen website under ethics. Okay, are there any questions? So what might be an interesting game to wake us all up is to think about what is unethical behavior. Let's start with what is conflict of interest. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to what a conflict of interest is, or perhaps even to think about cases where this has happened, famous in history?
Mies van der Rohe and Edith Farnsworth.
Mies van der Rohe and
Edith Farnsworth.
Edith Farnsworth.
House.
So what was why was that unethical? Or what was the
there's no objective finding, but there was the suggestion that they had a relationship and that he had misled her about what the house would do and that she refused to pay and all that.
So there's a rumor, or is that established?
It's, yeah, neither. I mean, there's. It's not documented, but contemporary sources were saying that.
It's an argument that has been made.
Yeah.
But there's no there's no.
The non-paying thing was objective.
Which non-paying thing?
That she didn't want to pay, and Eastwood David she countersue, or
What did she countersue for?
that it was not like a habitation. Was that argument?
Okay, interesting. Any other ones? Ones that were established? Come on, you guys must know all this gossip.
You just said not gossip.
No, well, that's true. Good point. Well picked up. What about Frank Lloyd Wright? Was it ethical for Frank Lloyd Wright to shack up with his client and leave his family? And go touring Europe with his client, having a wild and sordid affair while his manservant went mad and took to his family with an axe and burned down his house.
What? About the manservant?
One of his gardeners decided to murder his family and 5 of his kids. It's okay.
The gardener's family or Frank Lloyd Wright's family?
Wright's family.
Ah. That was like
But what about sort of smaller things? Give me examples.
I'm confused on why the gardener did it.
He lost his marbles and got violent and decided to kill everyone in sight and burn down the house.
But is that because of architecture?
Good point. That's just a good story. That's not actually got anything to do with ethics. But the fact that Wright was
but he wasn't there to protect them. Is that what you're saying?
The fact that Wright left his family, abandoned his family with the client, that I think there's an ethical question to be made, an ethical point to be made there.
Where's the morally between professional and moral personal? Yeah.
So I think the reason why there's an ethical question is that it calls into question objectivity. So if you have a personal relationship with a client to that extent, can the client then be taken advantage of by the architect for financial gain?
Where's the line with that? Because we do stuff for, like, it's known that architects do stuff for family all the time. So is there an ethical question in providing services to family members, or is it only in a romantic relationship?
But I think that's the thing. I think that as long as everything is clear and there is very clear terms of engagement, then that's fine, right? Because there's often people who do work for people that they're involved in. Yeah. But this is a known consideration when you go and you already know that they're your family when you're going to work for them, right? With Wright, he got a client, he got a new client who was married, and then he seduced his client, or maybe his client seduced him, and entered into this relationship after the boundaries had been set. So is there an ethical way out of this? What could Wright have done? Sorry?
Then get together? Wait till it's all over, then get together?
You see that works, you see, because once the project is complete, then there is no more conflict of interest. That's over and done. You can do what you like. You can destroy whoever's life you like after that, just as long as the project is complete.
Don't go wrong. The six was mine, the six. Just very, very good.
So what about these are historical instances, and there are a lot of them. You know, there's also the way that Corbusier treated Charlotte Perriand, his collaborator, who designed all of his furniture, but he was the one who was always listed as the designer. So that's hardly ethical, you know. And surely it should have gone down as the office of Pierre Jeanneret and Le Corbusier. So Corbusier is not doing anything to undo the myth of the individual genius, right? Which is, I think, is unethical. Okay, cancel. So these are big, sort of famous things. What about smaller things?
Not passing on the trade price.
Not passing on the, but you don't need to pass. Sorry? Ethical tender processing, that's true, and we'll get to tenders next week, so it's good that you're making that connection. But why do you need to pass on the, is there any conditions?
But to specifically choose them and not tell the client and pocket the difference.
So what's the way out of that?
Your solution. Or you pass it on.
What's another way out of that? Tell them,
Yeah,
right? So really it's just communication. Ethics are not trying to necessarily limit how much money you can make. It's just about actually making everything, bringing everything out in the open. Yeah. So just as long as the client is happy with that, then that's fine. You know, is it? Have you got any other examples? What about with staff? What's ethical in terms of how you treat your staff, or how staff should be treated?
My father-in-law says he must hire women.
Is he an architect?
He's an architect in New Zealand.
Holy crap!
New Zealand.
This
Not
is
years, so different code of conduct, and I was just checking before, but it doesn't specify actually in there.
No discrimination.
Yeah, it doesn't specify.
they have a. It's not in the.
So in their code of
They're
conduct.
very possible.
Yeah, they have, yeah. But he also said, they can't prove I'm not hiring them.
You could.
So you brought this. Have you brought this up with him?
He said it in front of me. I did work experience with him, and he said, I normally don't hire women, but I did do a job, and I was like, no thanks. No thanks.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And then his wife said, oh, but the cleanest woman, and he said, oh, that's okay.
Holy crap! That's quite shocking.
He's a shocking person. I try to avoid interacting with him ever.
Any other examples?
And paying appropriate ordering. She's paying your staff the right amount.
No.
Doesn't actually have an application.
And that's just bloody awful. It's really awful.
It's not that much, so I don't have to pay
Oh,
stuff.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's not only unethical; it's also illegal. And that's the thing, you know, with ethical codes, is that they cover much more than legal codes. So you can be doing something that is legal, but not necessarily ethical. So for anyone who gives you the argument that, you know, it's legal, so it is legal, so you can do it, you know, this is something to think about. What about designing institutions of oppression?
Of oppression, you say.
Procurement.
Sorry?
Procurement processes into the
No, but I mean, you know, what happens if you get asked to design, it's a huge job and be the biggest thing the office ever did, to design a nuclear power station.
Well,
Is it a
there,
test facility or is it like?
like,
No, like a full-on, you know, to produce commercial nuclear power.
But I'm saying that if it's for research or if it's for production,
It's for production.
then it's too case.
But for research, you'd be okay?
I think it doesn't.
But
That's a
it
personal.
would be Nick's personal opinion
Yeah.
versus somebody else's personal opinion. Well, like all the architects in that instance, like I think it would be your personal assessment of whether you thought it was ethical or not. Like I think there's scope for personal opinion.
And there are clearly people out there
I
who
mean,
think that
look
offshore
at
detention
Japan.
is okay.
Japan, isn't Japan
It's a bad thing. Bullying.
Yeah, bullying.
Could you make the argument
Ransom's hugely powered by
design a better system, like you said,
Yeah.
working from
No.
within?
Yeah, like someone's going to design this that maybe I can do the ethical, as ethical as possible route. Not that I'm saying it's the right approach to it.
Well, that's a question about
Yeah.
casinos.
Yeah.
There's a lecture and these people that design this proposal for a casino. I was curious about that because I think to me that's more black and white than even a power station. I use a power station, but their response was that if someone's going to make it, no matter like there's inevitability about it, so at least we have the opportunity to make it nice. Which is like a really glass half full, I think. And I tend to agree, but it still doesn't totally fit again.
There are things that clients do in the cases of a casino that they'll ask for that an architect can take control over, which is like the rooms, no windows, not being accountable for time passing, the scope that an architect could design an ultimate solution where the potential person using the space would be considered just as much as I mean, you might get fired, but you could try.
But that's part of the brief. You know, the brief says you
Yeah,
have to design
but
it.
but briefs have been known to be flexible.
So you're
I think that comes up next.
Yeah, through the oh, you don't want
I
to
think
go.
that comes up next question as well. What if you're a firm and you're presented with this brief, and then you think, well, if we say no, a less ethical business may take. So even though we understand we can't make a perfect solution, we can do something better than worse.
In the case of something like a casino, how do you weigh up your obligations to the client versus your obligations to the public? To like follow their brief versus
It's not illegal.
ethical.
It's not illegal. But I think also a casino is very clear cut. Casinos are places where people go to gamble. There's no doubt about that, right? But I think much more interesting if you're talking about gambling are like sort of links clubs. With you know like clubs that RSLs and what have you, they have lots of pokies in them, and you know like most sporting clubs have lots of pokies.
But they
Yeah.
are not profit also, so they support community organisations.
But we're designing one at the moment, and we have to keep the TAB and the focus in it because it's the only way they make money. So there's no point designing a nice new country club for a town if the only way it's making money right now is through focus in the TAB.
Is
Very
there
contentious.
is there then an argument that the company themselves should be providing the ethical solutions, not the architect? Like it's not your role to tell them to not build a focus area, whereas like the Hellenic Club is looking at ultimate solutions of motivating funds over pokies, mostly because they can't do as much as they used to, and the laws have cut down how much they make, so they're now doing buying property, etc.
I think they approached us and said, as the designers, you tell us what more we can do to make money and generate money so we can actually eventually get rid of these.
So you're actually actively being involved in the process to reduce the reliance on pokies.
Yes, they've asked us to, which is a difficult thing to approach, but yes, we've had to think of ways.
But I think that's a good thing. I think that is highly ethical to be involved in the reduction of these things, even though it might mean that you
provide them in the beginning.
You have to provide them in the beginning.
Yes.
I think it becomes so complex and subjective because architects are just one part of the puzzle. And if you maybe simplify it down, you have governments who basically make these laws and legislation. So maybe in a way you're saying they're sanctioning certain ethical activities or not, and then you have your client who can operate within those, regardless of what any individual or group would say is ethical. And then you have the architect who then enacts that design. And then there's all this critique, like you can look at the Panopticon, which wasn't just designed to be a prison, it was designed as a whole model for any sort of commercial activity, and people were saying it was great at the time. But now ethically we can look at that and say, no, that's a really horrible idea. But if the intention was there, does that still make it ethical?
And well, I mean, I think now with the panopticon is now digital. In China, they have an entire network of surveillance where they actually track your every action and move in order to what do they call it? You basically to build social capital. So if you buy too much booze, you lose points. If you only buy a little bit of booze, then it's okay. You buy no booze, then you actually go up in points.
And you can
Yeah, so much.
and it works by your association, and people can job you in.
No, they don't. No one needs to stop in because they're watching. See, look. That's why I've got masking tape over my.
I know, I have
Yes.
So just going back one slightly. I mean, this is just a totally different way of looking at it, not more devil's advocate. Is it ethical for a small segment of the population, i.e. architects, to make an ethical decision on behalf? So, for example, in a casino's case, like, really is it right for just a small interest group to just go over the top?
Well, I think it is ethical.
Power.
I don't think it's a commercial decision.
Yeah, no,
I
I
think
think
it's
one
ethical.
reason that point is that democracy, you've got greater power to just look after that. It's not really up to just one individual to make that decision on behalf of everyone.
Do you reckon that's mitigated because we are only one part of like a big group of people working together? If we were back in the original procurement of architecture, builder and client, then maybe that's more unethical because it's just one person making the decision.
We can't rely on other people's ethical decisions because that's their expertise. Like you need to rely on government's ethics and sort of agree or disagree, but that's political. And then you apply your own ethical standards within your frame of expertise.
What if you're a fundamentalist Christian, and someone comes to ask you to design a hospital where abortions may be carried out?
That's a personal.
It's personal again. They can say no if they want to. You can go to someone else. Like you can say no to the nuclear power plant. You can go if you don't want to. You don't have to. There's no gun at your head.
There's no gun. I like that. I'm going to start using that.
And
There's no gun!
That's a different field, but that's kind of an ongoing discussion in medicine and especially with GPs at the moment. So with doctors and GPs, there's currently no ethical impetus for them. Well, there's no legal impetus for them to declare if they're, Christian, whatever their religious belief is, what their stance on abortion or sexuality is. But now there's encouragement to make that an impetus so that you would have to say, as an architect, just letting you know this is my faith background, so you're transparent and you can proceed that way, or you can say, well, actually, we're not aligned, so we're not going to move together in that way.
So no abortions or Caesar Stone because it's against my ethnicity and religion. But Caesar Stone is an Israeli company and I don't support the Zionist taking over, even though it's not in China. So a lot of it in Israel.
Is it really Israeli?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I've never
And
looked
you
into
got
it.
you got to know these things just in case your clients are anti-Zionists. As opposed to
Is it then like the client's responsibility to tell you, like, am I supposed to ask every client all of these really deep probing questions to figure it out, or is it their responsibility to tell me I'm anti-Israel, so no Israeli products?
I think that's part of the briefing process. They can be as discriminatory as they want,
I think they have to tell you, but it's good for you to know so that you can go, okay, now we
I've never had a client that political.
I think you ask questions like, do you have a preference to kick things off?
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
From a very small anecdotal example being a waiter, I can ask a table if they have analogy or a dietary preference. And sometimes I say yes. So once I had like a Muslim couple, and you can't discriminate, but I would say there was no sort of symbolic or like clothing to kind of give me any indicators. And
You're-
they had something with pork in it, but they didn't tell me, so then it's not necessarily my fault. But then, as a business,
Did
we're
it become a
obligated
problem?
Sorry.
Did it become a problem?
Not really, but they asked for a refund. So yeah, maybe you could say that's a problem. But
It is a problem.
So they
Yeah.
expected you to have
Identify their religion.
yeah,
identified their religion and then suggested that that meal actually has pork in it.
I heard
Yes.
that same thing happened
Yeah.
when I worked in Labour and
yeah.
So the menu didn't say pork.
See, that's
See,
really the.
Yeah, so it was like a small component to the dish. Like it was in the liquor
shaved
stock or
pork
something.
crust.
Like
Bacon bits.
yeah.
How
It was something
fun.
small, like it was lamb, but it had been slow cooked in a broth that had
Ah,
that's
no,
Yeah.
that's tricky.
level.
yeah.
That's tricky.
Even if we did the right thing by asking, do you have any dietary?
Oh, so you did ask, and
Yeah,
then they
no,
came
yeah.
back to you.
And they said no, and then after they were eating, they said, "Oh, does this have pork?" It's like, well, yes.
It's a bit late now.
Yeah.
That's tricky situation.
Yeah. See, that's where it's an ethical thing of like, well, I understand that you can't have this, but we did the checklist.
But also,
But
like,
now, who's liable for this mistake?
Oh, now we're coming back to law of ethics.
Yeah.
Who's ethically liable?
I think they're ethically
you
right.
did your
Yeah.
due diligence.
You asked
right?
them and they said no.
And also, they might be like, they might have made a personal choice to eat whatever they wanted over what their personal beliefs were as well to consume. I mean, like, but also, yeah, I think it's really good that you're aware of their tradition. But like, if I had a traditional